What's up, guys? How's it going? Welcome to episode 6 of Coffee, and Pot. Today we are talking about defunding the police. Specifically, I want to talk about defunding the police without leaving women defenseless. There's a lot of great stuff. John Oliver's Last Week Tonight episode really covers a lot of the basics on, why current policing models are ineffective and inhumane. I don't really want to cover all that ground again. There's a ton of resources out there for you to check into as far as that, but I definitely recommend starting with that episode of This Week or Last Week Tonight, or the John Oliver Show. I'll post a link to it in the comments if you want to check it out. Some of the questions I think do need to be asked, though, specifically regarding this question of defunding the police. Like I mentioned before, why are current policing models ineffective and inhumane? I think there's some good answers to that, and you should look into it. How often do minorities actually call the police, specifically Black and Latin women? And how often is the police response satisfactory is another question that bears looking at. We've definitely seen some concerns from women within our own community saying, well, if I'm a victim of domestic violence and I can't call the police, what does that look like? Am I just left defenseless? No. But like I said, we need to answer this question. How often do minorities actually call the police, and how often is a police response satisfactory? So I would definitely invite any minority women that I have looking at this to please feel free to chime in. I will say from my experience from the Black and Latin women that I have spoken to, and Native women as well, that it's rarely, if ever, that they resort to police protection, even in instances of domestic violence, because police involvement often, if not always, further victimizes them. It's a question of privilege, and I hate to say it, that white women are able to comfortably rely on the police for protection in domestic violence instances, but it is something true and that needs examining. So that is certainly a privilege that white women have, and I get that they are scared to lose access to that protection. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that not everyone has that protection, and it's not often satisfactory. I certainly welcome any voices that have relevant experience to chime in the comments or shoot me a message. I'd be happy to actually get you on camera and talk to you about your relevant experience, because as a white male, I have none. In that specific regard, I do have plenty of experience living on the opposite side of that scenario where, coming from dysfunctional households, when police were involved in issues surrounding my family, the level of violence was always increased. The level of trauma was always increased. They never alleviated that. They always increased that level of violence that was happening. So real quickly, too, I'd like to talk about some of the scenarios where social programming could be more effective than a police force. All drug-related issues, research and as System of a Down has been noted, for saying research and successful drug policy shows that treatment should be increased and law enforcement decreased while abolishing mandatory minimum sentences. And that's fact. So we could certainly take that off of their plate and put that onto social workers' plate. Any and every, drug-related crime that occurs at the individual user level could be removed completely from the police's purvey. If you want to talk about, drug distribution and trafficking, that might be something different that we can look at, and do certainly need to find solutions to that. But in my opinion, the biggest and best solution to that would just be decriminalization. It takes away the black market, and it takes away their power and authority to wage violence upon people. So when we decriminalize, we bring all those players out of the shadows and remove their power. So that's certainly something that should also be part of this conversation. All mental health crises. We see video after video of folks who are in crisis, and the police show up, and it almost always ends up further victimizing them rather than putting them in a safe space where they can deal with whatever issues they are currently facing. So putting social workers on that front would also, again, remove a huge burden from the police and allow them to actually focus on defending folks from violent crime. Homeless issues. Again, criminalizing homelessness is the same sort of deal with criminalizing the drug issue. When we decriminalize, suddenly a lot of stuff becomes different. When we put social workers on the front lines of that fight, and somebody that is homeless and is in need of a place to stay, and maybe they're squatting on somebody else's private property or whatever, when you get a social worker that will come out and actually figure out ways to house that person and take care of that person, it certainly is a lot better outcome than arresting them. We could spend the same money. It costs a shitload of money to house people in jail, right? Why not house them humanely instead? It can be done. It should be done. And it would remove a huge burden from actual defense forces that are designed to protect people from violent crime. But we really get into the meat of the issues that I want to tackle, which is the defense against violence and who will protect us. Specifically, who in this next couple episodes, I want to tackle the question of who will protect women in domestic violence situations, in rape situations. The first thing I want to point out is that, do the police really defend us all that often? How often do Black and Latinx folk call the police? Again, we've sort of discussed that. They usually don't, because they're usually further victimized. But again, I'd love to hear from the folk about that. We specifically here in Springfield have a situation where I don't even know how long ago it was. It had to have been within the last year or 2 years. CNN ran an expose on the fact that we threw away over 300 rape kits, untested, unran, just threw them out because our police are not invested in protecting you. Rapists are rarely, if ever, actually brought to account for their crimes. Domestic abusers, even less likely. The fact that 40% of police are perpetrating spousal abuse should tell you something about how invested they are in the problem. They're too busy hiring the fucking abusers to really be invested in fixing this problem. So, maybe that's another problem that we can offload from them and, put on the community. How do we organize real community defense is the issue, and what does that look like? Because understandably, this concept would terrify women. It would terrify me, were I a woman and subject to that threat. So over the next couple episodes, I want to really dig into several different examples of what actual community defense looks like and how we can sort of tackle some of these issues without necessarily further victimizing folk by bringing the police in. Among some of the examples I'll talk about will be the Black Panther Party's community defense. I want to talk about some of the Rojavan Defense Councils. I want to talk about some of the Maori community defense councils. I want to talk about some of the Indian women who are organizing to beat the shit out of rapists and domestic abusers. I want to talk about some of the local stuff that we know of, like Isabella's house. I want to talk about the Zapatistas down in Chiapas and how they are organizing community defense specifically to protect women. I'm going to try to take a deep dive into several of those programs one at a time because I really want to give them due consideration. And today, I have, specifically spent the better part of this morning studying the Black Panther Party and how they organize community defense. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. So today we are kind of digging into the Black Panther Party and their community-led defense strategies, and I think that's something that is worth examining as a model that can be scaled up and moving from a vigilante platform into a community accountable platform. First of all, just a little bit of basics. In 1966 in Oakland, the Black Panther Party was formed by Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and several other gentlemen. Their primary function at this point in time was community defense street patrols, and it's exactly what you would expect. It was armed, militant, black folks patrolling their communities and protecting the people within those communities, primarily from police brutality, but also from many other issues. Stanley Nelson's The Black Panthers, The Vanguard of the Revolution documentary is a great place to start if you really want to kind of do a deep dive into the Panthers. I talked about how Fred Hampton was, infiltrated and killed in Chicago a couple episodes back, and that's also an episode worth checking out just to sort of get an idea of, the state conditioning regarding this stuff and, how the public opinion has been weaponized against the Panther Party. These street patrols were volunteer-based, and they were certainly vigilante in nature. But as vigilante as they were, they still did more good to protect their communities than the police, especially considering that they were often protecting their communities from the police. And that has to be weighed in consideration. A lot of the acts of violence that were perpetrated by the Black Panther Party were often instigated by state plants within the party. Again, that is something else that needs to be weighed in consideration. We can talk about how violent they were, but we also need to understand that a lot of that violence was instigated by the state. Even if it wasn't actual, police officers or FBI agents instigating the event, there were CIs or plants within the party that were specifically instructed by Hoover and by their local law enforcement handlers to instigate violence, to turn public opinion against the Panthers because they were giving breakfast to folks and protecting the community from violence much more effectively than the police were. So that's definitely something that bears consideration in this whole conversation. According to issue 111 of the International Socialist Review, Women in the Black Panther Party, as much as 60% of their membership was female based on an internal survey conducted by Bobby Seale in 1969. And that number grew to around 70% in the later years. So they had a huge female presence within the party, and they were, these women were operating on liberatory praxis, and they, just frankly weren't likely to take shit from people, not only outside of their community, but within their community, including their spouses, including rapists, and, other issues there. And sort of the reasoning behind that is that when you empower women to stop taking shit from the system, it's not a great leap to then see them stop taking shit from abusers within their own lives. That's actually really easy to take on compared to taking on state-sponsored violence. Kathleen Cleaver is quoted as saying, "What I think is distinctive about the..." Apologies again, the technical difficulties abound. Kathleen Cleaver is quoted as saying, "What I think is distinctive about the BPP is not how these gender relations duplicated what was going on around us. In fact, the world was extremely misogynist and authoritarian. That's part of what inspired us to fight against it. And when women suffered hostility arising or abuse and neglect and assault, this was not something arising from the Black Panther Party. That's what's going on in the world. The difference is that being in the Black Panther Party was that it put a woman in a position where when such treatment occurs, she was able to contest it. And, that's kind of what I just said, where whenever you empower women to resist oppression globally, nationally, even within their own communities, you're also empowering them to resist oppression, so they don't put up with abuse, first of all, and then second, they certainly don't return to their abusers. When you arm them with liberatory praxis, it makes a huge difference on how they allow themselves to be treated. That article also has a great roundtable discussion about the role of women within the party, and it's a super interesting read. But the point I want to make here is that empowering women to tackle outside oppression also empowers and positions them to tackle internal oppression from their families, their spouses, their communities in general. And like I said, that is a model that can and should be scaled up. Whenever we actively involve women in dismantling systems of oppression and systems of violence, it turns out they actually get pretty good at dismantling those systems within their own homes as well. So that's certainly something to consider when we're having this conversation about defunding the police. That's all I've got for today. So I'm going to keep digging, and specifically based on the request of a few women that are close to me, and they're rightfully scared of the concept of defunding the police because they want that protection to lean on. And so we're going to dig into this in further episodes and see if we can sort of outline what community-led defense actually looks like, how it functions, how it operates, and how it can be, in fact, more effective and more humane in addressing the issue of domestic violence and addressing the issue of violence perpetrated on women. Because obviously that's near and dear to my heart. Liberatory praxis is important. So I love you guys, and I will see you in the streets.